At 8 a.m. on a freezing Tuesday morning, my credit card was declined at the grocery checkout over a $40 bag of groceries. Standing there with the cashier staring at me, I pulled out my phone and called my father. His voice came through the line, calm, cold, and dripping with smug authority. "I canceled all your cards," he told me. "You're trained to follow orders, not manage money. It's time you learned your place in this family." I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I simply put my phone back in my pocket, walked out to my car, and drove straight to the bank. 3 hours later, my father had 32 missed calls on his phone, and his entire life's work was frozen solid. He thought he was cutting off a dependent daughter. He didn't realize who actually owned the empire he was standing on. Welcome back to the channel. Before we dive into what happened next, drop a comment below with the city or country you're watching from. I love seeing how far our stories reach. Make sure to stay tuned until the very end, because the twist in the final section will completely blow you away. Let's get straight into it. My name is Chloe Cooper. I'm 36 years old, and for the past 6 years, I've served as the head of operations for Cooper Global Logistics. I'm a former Army logistics officer, so when my mother passed away and left the family business in chaos, I hung up my uniform and came home. I didn't do it for fame or fortune. I did it to save my father's legacy from drowning in debt. When my credit card was declined at that grocery checkout, I assumed it was a simple bank glitch. But when I called my father, Arthur Cooper, his tone was far from apologetic. "I canceled all your corporate lines, Chloe," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You've gotten comfortable thinking you run this company, but you're trained to follow orders, not manage money. It's time you learned your place in this family." In the background, I could hear the faint mocking chuckle of Victoria, my stepmother, and her 28-year-old son, Julian. For months, they'd been whispering in my father's ear, pushing him to strip away my authority so Julian could step into my executive position. Arthur thought he was putting me in my place regarding a major real estate deal I had refused to approve for Julian. He assumed I relied entirely on his corporate allowance to survive. He genuinely believed he had just stripped me of my power, leaving me stranded and helpless. He had no idea he had just triggered his own downfall. To understand my father's arrogance, you have to understand how Cooper Global Logistics survived the last 5 years. When I left the military, the company was 6 months away from insolvency. Bad investments and terrible oversight had drained our reserves. I didn't just work 80-hour weeks to fix it. I invested my late mother's entire inheritance directly into restructuring the firm's debt. I streamlined our supply chains, secured military transport contracts, and rebuilt our corporate credibility from the ground up. Meanwhile, Arthur sat in his corner office, accepting awards, playing golf with board members, and taking full public credit for the turnaround. I let him. He was my father, and I believed in family loyalty. Then came Victoria. She married my father 2 years ago, bringing along her son Julian, a man whose entire resume consisted of dropped college courses and failed startup ideas. Within months, Victoria began chipping away at my father's trust in me. She convinced him that I was too cold, too rigid, and that Julian possessed the creative vision the company truly needed. Julian wanted a 6-figure executive salary, an unlimited expense account, and control over our prime commercial real estate assets. When I refused to sign off on Julian's reckless real estate development plan last week, Arthur took it as a personal insult to his authority. He believed that cutting off my cards would break my spirit, force me to apologize, and bring me to my knees. He thought money was his weapon. What Arthur, Victoria, and Julian failed to realize was that I never relied on his permission. As I sat in my car outside that grocery store, listening to the dial tone, I didn't feel panic. I felt a cold, sharp clarity. I started the engine and drove straight towards the bank. The glass doors of Commercial First Bank parted as I walked into the quiet, marble-floored lobby. I didn't wait in line. Instead, I walked straight to the executive office at the back, where Mr. Henderson, the senior commercial bank manager, was reviewing files. He'd managed our corporate accounts for over 20 years and knew every detail of our financial history. When he looked up and saw my face, his warm smile quickly faded into concern. "Chloe, what's happened?" he asked, standing up to pull out a chair for me. "You look like you're on a mission." "Arthur just canceled my executive credit lines," I said calmly, sitting down. "He thinks he's cutting off my allowance." Mr. Henderson stared at me, blinking in utter disbelief. "He did what? Is he out of his mind?" I pulled a leather folder from my bag and laid it on his desk. Inside were the master trust agreements and debt restructuring deeds executed 5 years ago. When the company was collapsing, Arthur had signed those documents to secure my capital infusion. In his arrogance and rush to avoid public bankruptcy, he hadn't bothered to read the fine print. "I need you to pull up the master account structures, Mr. Henderson," I said. "It's time to enforce the covenants." Mr. Henderson put on his glasses, opened his terminal, and pulled up the records. The reality was simple. The credit cards Arthur had canceled weren't drawn from his corporate revenue. They were sub-accounts funded directly by my primary master trust, a trust that held the primary lien over every asset, account, and property Cooper Global Logistics owned. Arthur hadn't cut off my money. He had just severed his own access to mine. Mr. Henderson looked up from his screen, a mix of shock and professional awe on his face. "Chloe, if we execute these covenants today, your father's primary executive accounts will be frozen instantly. He won't even be able to approve payroll." "Do it," I replied without hesitation. "Revoke his signature authority across all primary credit facilities, freeze the secondary corporate cards, and halt all automatic transfers to his personal expenditure accounts." With a few keystrokes, Mr. Henderson executed the orders. The financial lifeline holding up my father's lavish lifestyle officially snapped shut. 10 miles away, Arthur was sitting at an ultra-exclusive steakhouse downtown. He had invited Victoria, Julian, and 2 major commercial real estate brokers to celebrate cutting me out of the company. They ordered $500 bottles of wine and dry-aged steaks, with Julian boasting about the grand plans he had for my former department. When the bill arrived, Arthur casually tossed his platinum corporate card onto the silver tray. A few minutes later, the waiter returned, looking awkward. "I'm sorry, sir. The card was declined." Arthur chuckled, assuming it was a minor system glitch, and handed over his secondary card. Declined. Victoria tried her corporate card. Declined. Julian pulled out his allowance card. Declined. Every single piece of plastic tied to the Cooper name was entirely worthless. Panic rippled across the table as Arthur was forced to scrape together personal cash just to pay for their lunch. By the time he stormed out to his car, his smartphone was lighting up with alert notifications from every major vendor, supplier, and utility provider linked to the firm. My phone began ringing incessantly. Arthur's caller ID flashed again and again. I let every single call go straight to voicemail. By 2 p.m., Arthur had summoned an emergency board meeting. He was convinced that I had pulled a rogue stunt to sabotage his banking systems, and he wanted me publicly disgraced. When I walked into the glass-walled boardroom, the air was suffocatingly thick with tension. Arthur sat at the head of the long mahogany table, flanked by Victoria and Julian. His face was flushed crimson, his eyes blazing with rage. Sitting around the room were our 4 senior board members, looking confused and visibly anxious. "You've gone too far this time, Chloe." Arthur slammed his fist onto the table, his voice echoing off the glass. "You illegally tampered with my corporate accounts. I brought this board together today to officially strip you of your title, revoke your security access, and fire you from Cooper Global Logistics once and for all." Victoria smirked from her seat, while Julian adjusted his tie, trying hard to look like an executive taking over the throne. I didn't flinch. I quietly walked to the center of the room, set my briefcase down, and nodded to Mr. Henderson and my corporate attorney, who stepped into the room right behind me. "You can't fire me, Arthur," I said, my voice steady, ice cold and clear. "Because you don't own this company." Arthur let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. I built this empire. My name is on the building. Your name is on the sign, but my name is on the title, I replied. I opened my binder and distributed thick financial audit folders to every single board member. 5 years ago, to save this firm from your catastrophic financial blunders, you signed over 60% of voting equity to my master trust in exchange for my bailout capital. You aren't the owner, Arthur. You are an employee, and today, your employment is under review. The boardroom went dead silent as the board members flipped through the legal documents. The evidence was irrefutable. The master trust covenants had officially triggered, leaving me with full, absolute controlling authority over Cooper Global Logistics. Arthur's face drained of all color. He looked down at the paper in front of him, his hands trembling violently. Victoria gasped, her eyes wide with terror as she realized the golden goose had just been cooked. Julian sat frozen, his mouth slightly open, looking like a lost child. This can't be legal, Arthur stammered, his voice stripped of every ounce of its former bravado. You're my daughter. You can't do this to me. You didn't care about family when you tried to humiliate me over a grocery bill, I reminded him coldly. You wanted to play power games. Now you're playing by my rules. I turned my attention to Julian. Julian, pack your desk. Your unearned title is revoked, your salary is terminated, and if you step foot on corporate property after 5 p.m., security will escort you off the premises. Julian scrambled out of his chair and practically sprinted from the room without looking back. Victoria glared at me, but I raised my hand before she could speak. Your corporate credit access is cancelled, Victoria. The luxury vehicle leased under the company's name must be returned by tomorrow morning. Finally, I looked at my father. The proud, arrogant titan was gone, replaced by a broken man staring at the wreckage of his own hubris. You have 2 choices, Arthur, I said, leaning in across the table. You can quietly step down today with a modest retirement pension, or I will launch a full forensic audit into the corporate funds you illegally tried to siphon into Victoria's personal accounts. Choose now. Arthur chose the quiet retirement. He realized that fighting me meant public ruin, exposure, and potential criminal charges. Within 2 weeks, he quietly signed the severance papers and surrendered his executive keys. Without the steady flow of corporate wealth to fund their lifestyle, Victoria filed for separation less than 6 months later, taking Julian with her. I officially assumed the role of CEO, restructuring Cooper Global Logistics into a thriving, ethically run power enterprise. But more than saving the business, I reclaimed my independence. I learned that true power isn't about stomping on others or barking orders from a corner office. It's about having the quiet discipline to protect what you've built and knowing when to enforce your boundaries. Now, I want to hear from all of you. How would you have handled a parent or relative trying to use financial control to break your spirit? Have you ever had to stand up to someone who thought they owned you? Drop your thoughts and stories in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and click the videos on your screen right now for more incredible stories of justice and revenge. Thank you for watching.